Good evening, friends. I'm Deb Kraus, president of Eden Seminary, and I am delighted to welcome you all here to this year's Bracke lecture, a wonderful gathering of many different communities, our contextual education community tonight, with faculty and students and contextual ed supervisors, along with many friends of Eden Seminary and guests, and of course our wonderful speakers and respondents. We're so glad that you are here with us this evening. I'm just going to take a quick minute to give us some context for the name of this evening's lecture, the Bracke Lecture. The Bracke Lecture is named in honor of faculty emeritus John Bracke and Mary Bracke, his wife. They served Eden Seminary for many years. John on the faculty as professor of Hebrew Bible, as dean of the seminary, as a collaborating president of the seminary for a period of time in many different roles. And in his the end of his tenure at Eden, really took up, in response to the needs of the faculty and curriculum, the subject area of congregational leadership, and developed his capacity there to offer that gift for many years in a required course that had great impact. Mary Bracke served for that same time as our organist and choir director and as the director of the Eden Bookstore. And John and Mary together really modeled a tremendous passion for the church and its mission, and for the formation of leaders for the church. And so the Bracke leadership lectures are really an honor and a tribute to their remarkable contributions to the seminary. And so tonight we are delighted to welcome you all here and to gather to be inspired about trends in ministry and what they mean for the shape of the church and vocation in ministry, and to welcome and introduce our leaders. For this evening, I am so delighted to welcome to the screen Steve Lawler, who is the director of our Walker Leadership Institute. And Steve, take it away to introduce our speakers for this evening.
All right, thank you, President Krause. I am delighted that you all are here. This is a wonderful evening gathering to consider the future of co-vocational ministry, which is something many of us are on that path, and many more will be on that path as the future unfolds. So it's exciting to have Dr. Allison Norton with us. She's associate faculty at the Hartford International University, and she not only studies congregational life, but also migration studies. She teaches in a wide range of disciplines: sociology of religion, immigration, multicultural and intercultural and intergenerational ministry. She's published widely in this area and is, as I understand it, out and about more lately, traveling some. I will say that we also have with us two other people. So after Dr. Norton presents, then we'll have a couple of respondents. The Reverend Aaron Rogers is an Eden alum and a teacher and a preacher and a nonprofit leader, and somebody who creates, supports, and sustains good trouble wherever he goes. He's been on the staff of Riverside Church in New York City, and also Trinity Episcopal Church here in the Central West End. Works in the area of justice with the Faith for Justice organization, and is coming to us from Virginia Theological Seminary this evening. And then our other respondent is Dr. Raquel Letzum, who is professor of New Testament here, and has an extraordinary set of gifts that she brings to believers and to the church, not only as a scholar and an exegete, but also as somebody who teaches a variety of approaches to biblical interpretation, including womanist and liberationist approaches. She is also somebody who's traveling and on the road and visits at various seminaries, giving lectures and sermons, and is part of Eden's faculty and joined the seminary 2 years ago. So delighted that all of you are here. I have my pad, I have my pen. I'm really looking forward to all of this. So with that being said, Dr. Norton, welcome and thank you for being this year's Bracke lecturer.
Thank you. It is really such a real joy to be here and to be in conversation with all of you this evening. And I'll just say, fasten your seatbelts because I'm going to be sharing a whole lot of data with you over a really brief period of time. So just get ready and we'll take off here. But what I'm going to be doing this evening is taking a look at really 20 years of trends coming from the Faith Communities Today work at Hartford International University, and particularly the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. So the Faith Communities Today, we've been looking since 2000 on some of the wider trends affecting congregational life across the United States, and particularly thinking about 2020, and our latest large survey effort comes from 2020. We have one right now in the field, and so we'll be releasing reports probably in April. But the 2020 survey is the sixth and the largest. We had more than 15,000 respondents to that survey, and it represents 80 different denominations and faith traditions. It is a multi-faith initiative. And so it offers what is really an expansive and a sweeping portrait of congregational life in the United States. And if you think about it in terms of what was happening in 2020, about 2/3 of the survey responses were completed before the big shutdown that happened in March of 2020. And at that time, we made some tweaks to the way that we asked people to respond to the survey because of just the tumultuous chaos of what was happening in congregational life in March, April 2020. And we asked respondents to think about pre-pandemic. So what this 2020 survey gives us is really a immediately pre-pandemic baseline of looking at some of the trends over the last 20 years, and then particularly leading right up to the pandemic. I'm also going to incorporate tonight some of our emerging research in our 3 surveys that we have done in this post-March 2020 period with our Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregation study. But what I want to point out is that when you're doing work with surveys, you're always limited to the kinds of questions that these surveys ask. And in this particular FACT 2020 survey, I'll be presenting on insights from over 3,000 clergy who indicated that they were part-time, and compared with about 9,600 that indicated they were full-time. And I realize this use of the language of part-time and full-time doesn't really often accurately reflect the realities of co-vocational or bivocational ministry. But this is the way that we have phrased this in our survey, and it does give us some insight into the changes that we see across the landscape. So I'm going to start out looking at the broader context. What's happening broadly in congregations across the US, and I'm sure much of this will actually probably be familiar to you. So looking at some of these key trends, and then secondly, pulling them into what this means for what we see among co-vocational clergy. So one of the major trends over the last 20 years is, of course, the decline in median worship attendance among US congregations. So the median is that midpoint, which means that half have more and half have less. So 137 in worship attendance was the median in 2000, and you fast forward to 2020, and we see that that has been cut in half, with a median worship attendance on any given Sunday at 65 people in attendance. So over this 20-year period, we know that congregations have been greatly affected by lessening worship attendance over time. And if you take a look at this, we see that when we think about growth, it's also been affected. So in 2000, more than half of congregations reported that they had grown at 5% or more over the preceding 5-year period. You look at 2020, and we see that's now only about 1 in 3 congregations that reports that they have grown 5% or more over the previous 5-year period. So when you put these trends together, what we see is a picture of congregational life when there are many small congregations with few people in them. So nearly 75% of all the congregations in the US have only 14% of the people. And if you stop and think about what you might consider a large congregation, something in the top 10% in terms of size, you might be surprised to find that that number is only 250 or more in worship attendance. So the top 10% of congregations in terms of size are those that have 251 or more people in attendance. And these largest congregations, only 10% of all congregations throughout the country actually have 75% of all the people who attend church. So there's been a considerable increase in the number of very small churches, and this has consequent economic limitations as churches face as they think about providing pastoral leadership. And part of this reality is that fewer congregations can financially support a full-time minister. But what I also want to pause and draw our attention to is that there is, of course, some level of flourishing that is evident at every congregational size. So if you take a look at some of those things that we measure, that we consider reflecting thriving or vitally spiritual churches, we ask a question around how they rank their spiritual vitality. We ask questions about, is the worship service thought-provoking? Does it promote high levels of living out one's faith? Does the congregation have extremely high levels of conflict? And we compare across congregations of all size. We see that for each size, you have large numbers of congregations that are experiencing thriving and vitality. But one other trend that I think it's important for us to reflect on is that when we look at these shifts and the rise of the number of small congregations, we might think that this has corresponded over time with a rise and the increase of clergy that indicate they are part-time. And you will often hear claims being made that, we're seeing an increasing number of clergy that are bivocational or co-vocational clergy that are serving in a part-time manner. But if you take a careful look at the data, it doesn't actually support that claim. In 2000, we had 82% of the clergy who responded who said they were in a full-time position, but 10% out of that 82% actually said they had another job to supplement their income. So they were already in some kind of co-vocational or bivocational reality. And then if you look at the 2010, 2015, 2020, you see that it's actually held very stable in terms of the numbers of clergy, with about 3 out of every 4 reporting that they're full-time, 1 out of every 4 reporting that they are at on a part-time basis. So when we break it down a little bit further, though, not surprisingly, we see that it is those smallest congregations that are much more likely to be led by a part-time clergy person. So for congregations that have 50 or less people, 44% of those clergy are part-time. And if you compare this to the largest congregations, less than 2% of clergy in the largest congregations report being part-time. So what this means is that 82% of all part-time clergy serve in congregations that have less than 50 in attendance. So those were some of the pre-pandemic baseline trends. What I want to focus on for just the next couple of minutes before I hone in more carefully on the details on the characteristics of part-time clergy is how has the pandemic impacted congregations? What are some of the wider trends that we see happening at this stage, even while we recognize that things are very much still in flux and ministry leaders across the country are still experimenting, innovating, creatively responding to the events around the pandemic? One of the things that we see is that the pandemic has again, disproportionately affected smaller congregations. So we see this in terms of giving, where across the board congregations have not largely experienced a severe decline in giving as a result of the pandemic, rather whether it's through the PPE loans or the increased government assistance to families. For whatever reason, congregational giving has not decreased in the way that some thought it would. However, looking at small congregations, you see that they are more likely to report that they've had a decrease in their giving. So we asked them to, compare pre-pandemic giving, and 35% of the smallest churches have reported a decrease. Another thing to pay attention to is that smaller churches also report being more likely that their existence is threatened due to the pandemic. So we asked this question because of the pandemic, this church's continued existence is threatened. And you can see if you look at the percentage of congregations that agree with that statement, it's highest among those smallest congregations with 1 to 50 attendees, that 1 in 4 of those churches has indicated that the pandemic is likely going to cause them to close or in some way threaten their existence. So when we think about the reality that 44% of smaller congregations are led by part-time clergy, it just exacerbates the pandemic exacerbates the sort of trends of challenges facing in terms of resources and giving and support that small congregations have often struggled with. There's one more trend I want to draw our attention to, and that has to do with, at this time of limited resources for small congregations, the pandemic has also led to an increase on demand placed on congregations and their leaders due to the pandemic. And this has happened for churches of all sizes. So when it comes to food assistance, financial assistance, folks seeking support in counseling or spiritual guidance, the pandemic has largely increased the demands placed on congregations in response. And congregations have really risen to the challenge here. In our one of our Exploring the Pandemic Impact reports, we asked congregations what they've done in response to this need, and we've seen that churches have increased or added to their ministries in a wide variety of areas, particularly in response to the pandemic. And more than half of all congregations reported starting a new ministry in response to the pandemic or increasing and expanding what they currently offer. But this need and increased response is happening in a landscape where we're also seeing far fewer volunteers. And this is actually one of the more surprising findings as we reflect on some of the trends that we're seeing in the pandemic impact on congregations. So when we look at our FACT 2020 survey, over 40% of attenders in churches also served as volunteers. We saw a rapid decrease to less than half of that at 15% through summer 21, through end of the year 2021, only 15% of regular adult attenders were volunteering in their congregations. There's been a slight uptick in spring 22, but still representing fewer than half of the volunteers that you saw in congregations at pre-pandemic levels. So clergy and congregations are facing increased demand for resources and assistance. Smaller congregations are also seeing losses, both in terms of attendance, but also in terms of giving. And we also see across the board a decline in volunteers. So this led me to a particular question to think about tonight, and that is, does having a part-time clergy leader make a difference in terms of the percentage of volunteers that you see in your congregation? So I took a closer look at the FACT 2020 data, and interestingly, clergy employment status doesn't have a huge impact. And it doesn't necessarily lead to an enhanced lay leadership. So congregations that had fewer than 10% of their members volunteer also had the highest percentage of part-time clergy. 30% of those congregations were headed by part-time clergy. And this is slightly different when you think about the congregations with the highest percentage of volunteers. Congregations that had 75% or more of their adult attenders volunteering were headed by 27% of them by part-time clergy. So it doesn't seem to indicate that if you have a part-time clergy that there's necessarily then this lift from volunteering and lay leaders to sort of step in and play a greater role in the congregation. Final trend I look at on the impact of the pandemic writ large, before I focus in on part-time clergy in particular, is just to think about what we've all experienced and heard the last couple of years, that the pandemic has been a very difficult experience for pastoral leaders. And you've probably heard sort of the headline data of sort of 40% of all clergy are considering leaving the ministry. And when we asked this question, we did have 37% of clergy indicate that they had thought about leaving the ministry in the past year. However, when you break this down about how often they had this thought, we find that very small percentages of congregations, 3%, have clergy that very often considered leaving the ministry. So this perhaps is a less alarming view than the 40% of all clergy are leaving, but to see that the reality is that though it has been a very trying and difficult time, oftentimes it's only been a very small percentage of clergy that have said that they fairly often or very often considered leaving ministry. Another hopeful trend that we see is that for whatever reason, and this is one of those chicken and egg things, optimism does lead to enhanced thriving and vitality. So we asked, several questions that help us kind of indicate a scale around optimism about congregational optimism. Are they hopeful that they can emerge from the pandemic stronger? Are they willing to change to meet new challenges and realities? And we see that for churches that have high levels of optimism, they also report high levels of spiritual vitality. They are more likely to report growth, and that they are striving for diversity. And so this is a very hopeful finding, but it's also helpful to look at this across religious families and particularly denominational traditions, and look at the differences between Catholic and Orthodox, mainline Protestant, and evangelical Protestantism when it comes to how optimistic they are about the future. And I think it comes as no surprise that mainline Protestant congregations, in terms of decline in number of attenders and the like, have faced a hard road the last several decades. And yet, if you look at optimism, you also see that 21%, the lowest level of optimism, actually resides among mainline Protestant congregations. So I think we have to acknowledge the context of mainline anxiety about congregational vitality in the United States, but also point to the difference that optimism can make about that reality. So in the next few minutes, before I close, I'm just going to draw your attention to a few of the findings around part-time clergy. Who are they? So 1 in 4 of all clergy describe themselves as part-time. 14% of those said they were in unpaid positions or working as volunteers, and 62% of them had other paid employment outside of the church. And in that paid employment, they worked an average of 27 hours per week. And thinking more carefully too about what they did in that other paid employment, almost a quarter of them served in another church. 16% of them were also chaplains. But if you look then across the range for the rest of them, of what they did in that other paid employment, it was everywhere. We have everything from people serving as bankers to gardener assistants to faculty to lawyers to plumbers. I mean, it's just the broad spectrum of vocations outside of the church. 22% were previously retired from full-time ministry. 53% have an MDiv. This is not much different from full-time clergy. That 56% of full-time clergy have an MDiv, and 8% are first-generation immigrants. Mainline clergy are the highest percentage working part-time when compared with evangelical, Catholic Orthodox, and non-Christian faiths. So in the mainline landscape, 37% report working part-time. If you look across the majority race of attenders in the congregation, we see that multiracial congregations are the least likely to have part-time faculty. Majority white congregations are the most likely to have part-time faculty. The oldest clergy are also more likely to be part-time. And this goes back to, I think, the present previously retired. So almost 40% of all part-time clergy are 65 years of age or older. Similarly, women are also more likely to be part-time. We do ask for gender characteristics outside of male and female, but we didn't have enough people that were non-binary or a non-male or female gender identity to report statistics on those clergy. But I will say that if you compare male and female, 29% of female clergy are part-time compared to 20% of male clergy. And importantly for our conversations tonight, thinking about clergy well-being, self-care, we also ask clergy if they regularly schedule and take a day off each week from all of their paid employment. And not surprisingly, full-time clergy were more likely to say yes to this question. So about 71% of full-time clergy take a day off each week, with only 60% of part-time clergy taking a day off each week. So I'm going to close with both some likely challenges coming out of this complex reality as well as some possibilities for hope. So looking at some of the likely challenges that we see, We see, of course, impacts around the pandemic and pre-pandemic on attendance, volunteering, and giving concerns coming up, particularly among the smallest levels of congregation, which leads to a lot of questions around commitment of members and attenders in congregations. Do they have a level of commitment to sustain the life of the congregation and to pursue new models for ministry that aren't so clergy leadership centric? So there are some challenges ahead, I think, in cultivating a multi-vocational mindset within congregations writ large, because we know developing a co-vocational or a multi-vocational mindset is more than simply coming to an agreement about changes in numbers of hours worked or budget allocations for clergy. But rather, it really is a visioning for shared ministry, a visioning for shared leadership to accomplish God's will. And it's not just about a service for a contract for services rendered. So bivocational ministry or co-vocational ministry can be, I think, imagined as an intentional practice of an entire faith community, but it's happening in a time when we're seeing lessening commitment. We're also seeing rising anxiety around declining participation and involvement and questions around church closures and mergers over the next several years. We also have seen clergy leaders change, adapt, innovate over and over and over again for the last 3 years, which can lead to real exhaustion and burnout. And then on top of this, we have all these new ministry patterns emerging. Numbers of congregations that are continuing to do some kind of hybrid ministry remain very high, where congregations are attempting to do ministry in settings that have a significant virtual audience and participation alongside a face-to-face and co-present community. I think we also see some challenges around the ways in which co-vocational ministry or commitment is perceived as half-hearted. And there is still, I think, a stigma attached to especially part-time clergy leaders. And then there's questions on how do we support the many women and retired senior clergy who are in part-time positions, and are there inequities in their power? And then to conclude, a note of hope, some of the positive opportunities that we see. If there's one thing that the pandemic has done to congregational ministry, it has made the way we have always done it not only disrupted, but a bit suspect. It has been seriously disturbed because innovation has been a necessity. Crisis has led to innovation and has disturbed the sense of settledness or the resistance to change, which I think leads to the possibilities here for new models, for different dynamics, for rethinking in many ways what it might look like to be creative, innovative, and experimental, to adjust to what is increasingly the new normal for many congregations around the country. And this can lead us into a reinvention rather than a replication of our old patterns. It also leads us into a deeper opportunity for partnership with others. The networking that has come over the past several years as churches have connected with their local social services, governments, other nonprofits, other congregational communities to build upon, enhance, and grow those relationships in support of co-vocational clergy leaders. And then also, to conclude, just a reminder that optimism does make a difference, and that in a context of anxiety, we can lean into imagining hopeful new visions of the future toward collaborative, imaginative models for co-vocational clergy and clergy thriving. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. My hand was having a hard time keeping up, so I'm grateful that this is being recorded, and there'll be a chance to savor so many of these wonderful insights. A couple of questions that came up from people in the chat. One of them was really tracing this hybridivity. And so in the research, did you have a sense in the sample of congregations, a large, wonderful sample, of how many people were after COVID tracking attendance in virtual versus in physical space?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we have been tracking with the 3 surveys we've done thus far in the post-pandemic, post-March 2020 reality. And one of the things that I think we're clearly seeing is that the virtual is not going away. And so by end of 2021 into summer of 2022, we saw that about 85% of all congregations were doing some hybrid form of ministry, where their worship service was both some form of virtual and some form of face-to-face. Now, this looks widely different, right? I mean, it's very different to say just simply live stream your face-to-face service and do a Facebook Live, versus really creating, I think, a sort of robust space of engagement for the virtual community and audience. But congregations across the country many of them are continuing to have a significant virtual community. And I think it's leading to a lot of questions around both sustaining the sustainability of this over time, particularly for congregations with fewer resources. But also it differs across tradition. So fewer Catholic and Orthodox congregations are hybrid compared to mainline and evangelical. But it's something we're paying really careful attention to and are excited to learn from congregations that are doing this well. And so one of the things that we're exploring in our study is in-depth qualitative case studies of about 100 congregations across the US, and kind of exploring in more depth what we can learn from those congregations that are doing hybridity well, because it can be quite challenging.
And another question that came in is about the do you, in the survey process, was it easier to get part-time clergy to respond, harder to get them to respond, thinking that sometimes multi-vocational or co-vocational people, when you said earlier, it's not really a part-time job in terms of a commitment of hours. So how did you all manage that potential?
Yeah, that's a great question. Getting people to complete surveys is just hard. So if anyone here really likes to take surveys, send me your name and email address and I will sign you up. But given the comparison of our trends with similar studies, such as Mark Chave's work with the National Congregations Survey and others, it doesn't seem like we're missing a large portion of part-time clergy, but that they have pretty similar to their full-time counterparts been completing the survey. One of the things, though, that I think we do see is that our survey method is a bit unique, and that we do it in partnership within many denominational structures. And so the ask to complete the survey doesn't come from some untrusted or unknown outside source, but comes from within. So United Methodists get an ask from their own office, please complete this survey. UCC, same, right? Ask from your own denominational offices to complete the survey, which leads us to have a much higher response rate. And then in turn, each of these denominations can do their own reporting, right, out of these findings.
Okay. And those studies are published on your website, is that correct?
Yes, yes, that's right. I should have done this, but I have one final slide here with our information. So anybody who wants to learn more, Our Faith Communities Today research, our Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations research. Please check out our reports, of which there are many, and continue to learn more. Sign up for our newsletter.
Great. Thank you. We're going to shift gears a little bit and hear from a couple of people who are themselves. I'm sort of latching on to this multi instead of co or bi vocational, because I are one or have played one on a prior life. And so let's start with you, Reverend Rogers. If you would talk a bit about your experience with this kind of way of being in ministry and what your experience has been with that. And then are there practices that you've cultivated to help you not only survive, but thrive in a kind of multi-ministry life?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that wonderful and insightful presentation. Before my comments, I do have to shout out John Bracke. What a fantastic professor and legacy of congregational leadership and excellence from Eden Theological Seminary, but that is stretched forth out into the world. So I have to say, I have not known a ministry day, time, or moment that was never co-vocational in some ways. And I like the phrasing of co-vocational. And Steve, I know you're all on the multi. I know she got you with the multi and you love it. But if you could just let it go for a moment and let me talk about co-vocational and why I like the term. Because co has a sort of implication that things, one, don't exist separately, which you kind of get with bivocational, but then two, that there's some sort of coordination, that they work together with other things. And so this co-vocational ministry gives a sense of multiple calls kind of coordinating or working together. And I like that kind of sentiment to it. And so I grew up, getting up in my initial days of ministry were in the context in serving churches that could not often support the needs of the pastors that they needed. One example comes to mind. My first church that I served was in New Madrid, Missouri, 2.5 hours from St. Louis, going off to see a church full of 4 elderly seasoned saints that one welcomed the opportunity to have a pastor, but were very clear that they didn't need one at the same time. And so that was my first start into ministry. And so every day afterward have been some sort of iteration of working, one, not specifically in a ministry silo, but two, to a point made earlier in the presentation, working with people, and we didn't use this term in the context that I was in at the time, but working in a context definitely of reality of people with multiple orders and orders of shared ministry happening in a particular location. I would also say that as I have grown in ministry and understood my own sort of call, I've been more likely to understand it to have been in relation to other things that kind of give life and fulfillment, rather than necessarily just one context where everything was supposed to be fulfilling and satisfying and all those things. Multinodal kind of ministry is something that I have seen from ministry leaders that have inspired me, ministry leaders that I've worked with, that what you are called to, even though the mission and the vision may be singular, it may have different expressions based on the context in which you are in. And so one aspect of kind of how we've been having that conversation is in resource conscious places, in congregations that can't necessarily afford pastors in those positions. And I would like to flip that a little bit to really think about in terms of pastoral fulfillment, right? A lot of clergy people aren't fulfilled just, just in their churches in some type of way. And maybe have other gifts, other skills for ministry. They may be more realized in other contexts. They may be celebrated in other contexts, more affirmed, might meet a specific need more fine-tunedly. And so I think that's just something to think about, and something that has definitely been resonating with me in my own ministry. There are some gifts that I have that a church might never see. Flat out and simple. There might be some gifts that I have that a church that I work at may never move into a space where they can accept. But there are places in the world where that gift is needed. And so, being able to exercise that gift, being able to exercise that calling in a different capacity, maybe in a different context that wasn't so focused in the church, has given me life in my pastoral ministry, right? It has allowed me to be inspired in ways that pastoral ministry hasn't always given the cake to, if I can just be honest about it. And I think that is something that needs to be considered and appreciated, that we have pastors who are multifaceted, who have plenty of gifts, who have this hybrid nature about them. And as we continue on in this like ever-changing world, that is going to predominantly be the case, right? That people are going to continue to be more multifaceted, have a plethora of gifts, especially after stress points and dynamic moments like a pandemic, where maybe before you did not know how to use Zoom, but now after you're a Zoom expert, right? So in a world where challenges create this kind of response where we need to be multifaceted, where we need to be nimble, where we need to have this kind of jazz posture about ourselves, where we can be nimble and collaborate and also improvise and also coordinate and work in the group, this kind of jazz ethic. It's important that our congregational context also kind of represent that truth about the reality of the clergy that they are calling to meet the challenges of this new day and age. And then I would like to add, in terms of co-vocational ministry, the thing that I have a sense about when I think about it is I think about a need-based ministry rather than a ministry that works with a very kind of hierarchical, dominating kind of perspective. So I think about this kind of orthopractice rather than orthodoxy kind of framework, right? That we are seeing what is needed and we are responding to what is needed. The call that is on us is not just a call that lives in isolation, but responds to the needs in the world. There are a lot of needs in the world, right? And our call will be contextually and situationally different based on what is called of us, right? Great leaders are sometimes formed in the crucible rather than in a factory. And so when we get to that point, when we understand that we make room for this kind of nimbleness in ministry, but still grounded in purpose, right? Still grounded in a profound sense of calling, but able to meet a variety of different needs, based on what the situation kind of allows.
Wow, thank you. I may have come over from the multi to the co. You did that. You brought it. And I think, the creative, innovative, collaborative part, that's really profound. And as you said, the jazz of it. Dr. Ledson, what kinds of things did you hear tonight? What kinds of things do you reference and share about your own journey and experience in living this kind of life?
Right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Steve, for this opportunity. And thank you so much, Dr. Norton, for laying the foundation for this. Aaron, I'm definitely picking up on your language. And I'm so glad that you went first, because it really helped me to sort of see an evolution in my own journey, right? So, I started thinking about these terms of co-vocational and multivocational and all of that. And I would say that when I started out, I was probably multivocational in the sense of I was fortunate enough to be able to work full-time in a congregation that paid me a living wage. And so there wasn't necessarily the financial need. I mean, I wanted to do more things, so maybe yes. But I could survive off of that salary, right? I was getting healthcare, all of that, which was great. But there was also a sense in which I was called to some things that I couldn't really do in the congregation, not because I was prohibited, but because everybody didn't want to learn Greek. I don't know why, but they just didn't. And I wanted to explore things at a deeper level. I really wanted to put into play the academic training that I had. And so there was some space for that, but not at the depth and the level that I really wanted to do that. And so in that sense, I think I became sort of multi-vocational and started doing the writing and the preaching and the teaching outside of that congregational setting while I was doing this full-time ministry. And then after about 18 years of doing that, with life changes and world changes, I think that's when I really moved to co-vocational the way that Aaron described it. That it is really looking at, for me, the things that I felt truly called to and coordinating those things. And so giving them sort of equal play, that doesn't necessarily to me mean equal time. There are seasons, and when teaching is setting the forefront, or preaching is setting the forefront, or writing is setting the forefront, but they're all together within the call. When I was grounded in congregational ministry, I felt as if there were only certain things that really defined me or could define me. So I didn't feel called to be a senior pastor, so I couldn't fit neatly in that particular box. I had a very strong sense of calling to teach, but for those of you who come in out of the Black church tradition, teaching is an insult. If you get up and somebody says, "Oh, you really taught," what they're telling you is you didn't teach, you did not preach, you did not do your job. So it was really moving out of those cultural understandings and appreciating and recognizing the teaching gift that lay within me and giving that the same kind of attention and play that I did to the preaching. And that occurred moving sort of out of that particular or that soul defining ministry setting. Co-vocational now for me is doing more, having a sense of call to more than one form of ministry, and it is operating in more than one setting. So for me, it is in person, it is hybrid, it is purely asynchronous, it is teaching at Eden, it is running a nonprofit that is really aiding people in teaching, preaching, and aiding people in interpreting scripture for preaching, teaching, and living. It is coaching clergy people, using my time in the parish ministry setting to help people with moving scripture into more fruitful sermon development practices, helping them to do time management so that they're not always doing Saturday night specials, helping them to do some deeper biblical study to sort of reinvigorate their preaching, and holding all of these pieces of myself together. It also has meant for me developing a clarity around my call and my passions, and being honest about what I have to offer and what I enjoy doing. Because there's a lot of things that I can do, and I said this with my Eiffel class this past week, there's a lot of things we can do, but there are certain things that we're called to do. And I believe we are called to live out our call and not out of our can. And I think early on, as I crafted spaces for myself, I leaned into the can because I looked more at, prioritized what I thought people needed as opposed to what I was really good and enjoyed giving. And it did drain me. And so a shift really had to be made where I really looked at what I was called to do, where I sort of saw the gaps and the places that I could fill and do it with that optimism and joy, Allison, that you talked about, to like spread that optimism and joy and hope to the people that I was dealing with. And that's where I really found flourishing in ministry. That's where I really found impact with the people that I served. And that's where I really saw that there is so much room and space out there that is increasing rather than some of the numbers that are, that we see in the trends that are saying they're like decreasing, right? So like right now, I see during the course of the year, I've got like 1,800 people moving through various ministries and Bible studies, an average of 500 people per series. So there are people there, there is a hunger there is a need there is openness and willingness to participate there. And I think there's great ground to coordinate, because I'm very clear, I'm not a pastor, so I'm not trying to set up a church. So I look at the ways that I can partner with other ministries and how I can help ease the load. So I'm hoping that we're really moving into a space with co-vocational ministry where we're not so wed to the numbers as the sign of success, but the impact, and that we don't have to do it in silos, but we really can open ourselves up for the ways in which we can really help one another in meeting the needs and doing the work that we all feel called to.
So another part of this, and I'm just, again, writing away. This is the night of writing. Do you have an imagining? So you talked about your journey of 18 years, is that right? Do you have an imagining, pardon me?
The first 18, we're
first
several
18, okay.
more years in now.
All right. Do you have an imagining of what sort of on the horizon looks to you to be call? What you feel like, okay, 5 years out, 10 years out, I can imagine not only my sense of call, but the church in ways that we're birthing, we're witnessing, we're seeing emerge, but aren't with us yet, are on the horizon. Yeah.
Not in so much a concrete form. What I do imagine and see is that that the boxes are open. That's the way I would define it. Like, I have felt that for my entire life, I've never fit into the prescribed boxes and pathways that so many people either pretended they fit into or actually did, that I was always sort of having to retrofit something, create something new, or just take a leap of faith to do something different. I see us coming into an environment in which that's the norm, in which it's not sort of cookie cutter understanding of call and vocation, but it really forces people to have a real relationship with God and hear what God is saying to them, and not just simply take what's always been done and default to that. And to bring to bear sort of the fullness of who people are. Like Aaron, you talked beautifully about sort of all those pieces of who people are, the wholeness of who we are to ministry, because I think that also is a safeguard against the burnout. Like, if I'm doing something where when I'm only doing my can and what everybody else wants, and there's no room for my passion, I'm dead on the vine. But if I have a chance to really hear what it is that God is saying to me and can bring that into the world, and maybe other people are doing the same thing and we can partner together, to me, that is just thriving, fruitful ministry that benefits the servant and the ones being served.
Yeah, can I just add to that right quick? In terms of like new on the horizon, not only is the church calling for itself this different type of pastor that must be multifaceted, and there's different type of people that must be multifaceted, but it's kind of interesting to me that it's requiring the same thing of space as well, right? It's very interesting that they're having this conversation about church buildings and stuff like that, how they can be repurposed, how they can be made more useful, more responsive, if they even need them. That's the same kind of conversation they're having about clergy and pastors and all this kind of space. It's the same kind of conversation. And so I see that Church on the Horizons is thinking imaginatively about all its elements, right? It's ordained elements, not only just people, but also about space. And I also think that anytime that there's like a seismic shift in terms of world-changing events, we're always going to see a couple of different things like emerge. There's always going to be different priorities and different motivations and then also different capacities. We saw some of that in the presentation by Allison earlier when she was talking about far fewer volunteers, right? You see all of those things resonate. It's like, you know, the reason why we might have far fewer volunteers is because they have different priorities, different motivations, and different capacities after the seismic shift. And the same thing is true about the church as a whole, right? We are negotiating and navigating this kind of wellspring of different priorities, different motivations, and different capacities, and how those things kind of speak to each other in a variety of different ways. And so the new church, the church on the horizon, is going to have different motivations for ministry. Collaboration, I think, is one of those things that will pop up to the front, right? That collaboration is going to be far more significant than what we can produce individually or by ourselves or in our siloed spaces. An example of different capacities, we talked about pastors coming together in a variety of different ways to work in a particular context. Some pastors have multiple churches. Some pastors are part-time at a church, or 25% time at a church and 45% in another church, right? And so those capacities are going to be different. And then priorities, and this is something that is going to be very, it's always a relevant conversation for the church about what we choose to prioritize. Well, I think these changing demographics and shifts in terms of just our lives is going to make us evaluate certain things and give different priorities to those things that hopefully will lead us to more life-giving spaces.
Mm.
Yeah.
So in listening to both of you respond, I'm wondering, and Dr. Letson, with you first. So one of the things that people mourn, I think, in the congregational side is, oh, we can't afford a full-time pastor anymore, so we're less than. And where it sometimes, certainly in my own experience as somebody who's had vocational life, other clergy would talk to me about it because they would feel, as their congregation experienced financial decline or less giving, that they were being undervalued, or they. So how did you, in this journey, manage that? Maybe the model that's still resonant in certainly larger churches, which is, it's my job, I have benefits, it's what I do, it's 100% of my time, whatever that is, to coming to a space where your vocation was freed of that, and also your sense of how the money works, because that's a piece of what I hear congregations struggle with, and I hear individuals struggle with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a couple things. One, I went through a period of very hard soul searching, honesty with myself, and wrestling about my identity. Mm-hmm. Like, who am I and how am I going to make a difference? And have I done what I need to do with the things that I have been given? Like, that was like a very real struggle point for me, because I couldn't, when people asked me what I was doing, I couldn't just list a one-liner. Like, I am this. I didn't have a particular title or an institutional connection. And therefore it was like, well, what are you doing? Right. And even if no one was saying that to me, that's, sort of how I felt. Mm-hmm. And so I had to really get clear about what my own priorities and where my own sense of peace came from. Mm-hmm. And also what my ego needed and what it didn't. Like, that to me just became a really real question. Did I need a particular certain things in order to be who I felt I needed to be? So one was that internal struggle. Two, it was looking at levels. So I was able to build a base, and I can't, so I just happened upon a lot of this. Like, I can't say do it this way, because it was just a lot of different things that fell in place. But while I was in full-time ministry and I did earn a salary, I was able to make connections, gain skills, reputation, and certain things, so that when I did move outside of the institutional, arenas, I did have some level of support there. Financially, I had to think about the models just basic bottom line budgeting. For me, it didn't come into play as much because I was fortunate enough to have a partner who supported me and was like, we have allotted this amount of time for you to do this amount of stuff and build from there. So what I would say is put a plan in place because you don't have to get there overnight. And I think sometimes we think the change has to come like immediately. It may be a gradual movement into these places and spaces, and that's okay. Now in hindsight, it looks like, oh, wow, I've been here for so long and this is really what I'm doing. But there were years, like years of evolution to get to a place where I could do these things that I'm doing and to do them at the level that I'm able to do them professionally, financially, all of those kinds of pieces. But I would say to people, trust yourself and trust God. I really believe that when we walk into who we are authentically, the people who need us can recognize us and the resources that are for us can find us.
That's a wonderful, powerful way too, because one of the things I also hear is that as people move into this, their identity is institutional.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about an institutional identity. You're talking about, as you said, it's not a can, it's a call. It's stepping into this. And so who you are and who God's called you to be and how you're responding to that shows up. And if part of that has its life in an institutional setting, great. And if part of that has it not an institutional, great, because that faithfulness navigation is, that's so helpful. I think too, sometimes this is the portfolio age that we don't have, we're not contained in an institution, we have a portfolio. And just like people who love to cook a variety of things or play a variety of musics or speak various languages or whatever, it's not that, like you said, it's opening up the box. So thank you for both of you for really remarkable responses. We're going to take some time now. Some of the folks who are with us are part of progressive Christian leadership classes, and they are going to be spending time in their breakouts talking about this. And then those of us who are not in those classes are going to be also in a breakout session and having conversation about what we heard and what it evoked and what we're continuing to be curious about. So we're going to do that for the next period. And we have two remarkable technologists with us who will make that so. And then we'll be back together just right around 8 o'clock for some final words from Dr. Norton and a closing. All right.
So the breakout rooms have been opened. You've been invited to join one. You see a pop-up come up. You can just click, go to or join the breakout. And I will continue to sort all of you and make sure you guys pop into your correct places. Dr. Zaria, I see you. I'm going to put you over there in 3. You should head that way. Zaria, did you see a pop-up on your screen? You can click join. All right, Allison, let's see. I need to put you over with the Allison, did you see a pop-up on your screen? You can.
Yes, I did. PCL 1. But I thought I was supposed to be in the public.
That's
So
correct.
should I join public guests?
Nope, let me move you to public. There you go.
Okay.
Mark,
I was in the wrong room, I think.
where are you supposed to go?
PCL 2.
All right. 2. You should see a pop-up now.
Thank you.
Yep.
technician of all the earth and all the planets of Star Wars and the intergalactic. Okay, go ahead and mute me, Katie. Go right on ahead.
We're welcoming everyone back, and remarkable conversations. Certainly we had remarkable conversation, and I imagine that all of you did. We've asked just in the last period of time if Dr. Norton would just reflect on this evening and any additional thoughts. And then, you shared an important link for us. So, anything else that you'd like us to be aware of as resources and tools as we enter into our own discernment about our ministry and vocations.
It's been a great time together. I think the only thing I would leave us with is just a sense of grounding in the reality that for many faith communities, co-vocational ministry is the way things have always been done, and not something that's come about because of crisis or a response to dissettled times, but rather it's just reflected the reality of how church has always been done. For about 15 years now, I've been in lay leadership at a West African church, both in Los Angeles and also here in Hartford. And given the realities of church life in Ghana, the entire church model is built on a sense of a co-vocational model. And the local level congregations are pretty much run entirely by a dedicated, committed lay leadership. And just to bring that to our attention and to remind us that we don't have to innovate or respond to these realities without a collaboration or partnership that we can gain from those many others who have come before us and are in our midst now, for whom co-vocational ministry is the norm. And I think there's much that we can learn from them about what clergy thriving looks like, how to create a vision and a community for shared leadership that transcends the sort of clergy lay leader divide, and the ways in which we can continue to destigmatize clergy and their positions that may be part-time. I also just want to say that I've been inspired by all of our comments tonight around the ways in which, as the respondents have said, the boxes are open to us and the choices are expanded when we think intentionally about co-vocational ministry. So I just invite you to check out our research. You can go to covidreligionresearch.org and find out more.
Wonderful. Thank you. President Krause, would you have some closing words for us?
It's been a wonderful evening, an evening fitting of the Bracke lecture legacy, and we're grateful for Dr. Norton and Reverend Dr. Letzum and Reverend Rogers' reflections. It's really just been a great evening. One of our infused goals in our curriculum is vocational resilience. And I have just been thrilled to see in the chat all of the sense of confirmation and encouragement that folks have been taking from the conversation and from the expertise shared and from the real vulnerability of people's journeys that have been shared. And Dr. Norton's closing challenge to see the resources for this discernment in our midst, in the church, in the global church, and many, many models to be engaging. And so we're grateful for the resources and for the fellowship that holds that in the spirit. And so let's be about this work together, and thank you, and God bless everyone this evening. Thank you so much for coming. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you at the next event.